I started Bill Amberg's studio in 1984, and we've been making everything you can possibly imagine in leather ever since. Leather is a really extraordinary material. As far as I'm concerned, it's endlessly fascinating. Any skin can be turned into leather. You remove all the fat and the protein from between the fibres of the skin, and you end up with this collagen fibre. This is a piece of rawhide. You'd see that on the top of a drum. That's where you're probably most familiar with it. And it's just raw collagen fibre. There's nothing between the fibres at all. It's very hygroscopic, it's ferocious, it's incredibly strong. You can use it for binding things, tomahawks, all those stuff. They've all used this. You can take it further. You can take it in this form as a rawhide into something more interesting, which is what vellum is. Something like that. Now we're getting kind of more beautiful and more elegant. And these are materials that were the original lampshades. If you put a light behind it, you can see you can get a light through it. But it's still effectively a rawhide. It's still just a piece of collagen fibres with nothing in it. And it will rot. As soon as you wet this and stick it in a plastic bag, it goes back to flesh again very, very quickly. Early man, I mean literally the kind of, your Neolithic chap, he figured out that if you immersed it in a liquor of water and tree bark, you could put something back between the fibres and make it flexible and soft again and stop it rotting. And that is the process of tanning. And they use tannins. So these materials here, this is vegetable tanned leather. Now, vegetable tanned leather has obviously come a long way, but effectively since early man to the present day, they're still making exactly the same material. The process has got a little bit more sophisticated, but not much. Some of the tanneries in England are still Dickensian. They still have exactly the same processes of pit tanning. The leather is immersed into a liquor of water and tree bark, and it sits there for months, and it soaks up all the fibres, and you end up with this lovely stuff. This is tanned in mimosa. So all of these tannages are based on where the trees that are growing. This is tanned in oak bark. They've got quite different characters. They'll do quite different things. For 300 years in England, you were only allowed to tan with oak bark, because when we were building our navies and cutting down the forests of England, all our oak trees, they decided to turn all the tree bark into oak bark tannages. And we became very, very good at oak bark tanning. There's now only 2 real oak bark tanners left, but it's the most fantastic material. It's absolutely beautiful. When the skin comes off the animal, it's obviously got its hair on. So the first thing that you do is you try and remove the hair. So you put it in a lime pit, and the lime takes all the hairs out. You can leave the hairs on, and you end up with really beautiful materials like that. As soon as you take the hair out, you then got this very, very thick piece of skin, because when it comes off the animal, it's up to 3/4 an inch thick, depending on the animal it comes from. So you split laterally down the animal, and you end up with lots of this stuff, which we call split. And that's suede both sides. It's got no strength intrinsically. We're now using it a lot in interiors, and the panels on the wall there are using this stuff. It's very, very elegant and lovely material. It's got a great drape to it, lovely weights, completely light proof, so we're using it for curtains and all sorts of things. When plastic started to become really popular, the leather trade, as a kind of knee-jerk reaction, started to try and create materials which were completely uniform. So they would take split leather, cover it in a very, very heavy plastic coating, and then print a grain on it. It's still leather technically, but it certainly has no character, and it has no patination. It won't do what I would consider good and normal leathers do. The decisions that an architect or an interior designer can make, basically there are 4 principal variables that you can play with: scale, colour, texture, and finish. And all of those things are literally infinitely variable, depending on exactly what you want to do. The principal decision that you would make to start the process is scale, because for any designer or interior designer or architect, you're dealing with proportion. So as soon as you've worked out the proportion of your room in terms of light and shape, you then want to think about what panel size you want to be using. Now this is a cowhide. Obviously, it's really quite big. So that's about as big as they come. So you can go that big if you want to in terms of wall paneling or scale when you're thinking about something that you're going to do. And then you can take all of those other elements that I've been discussing and apply it to this scale. You can dye it this colour. There's various ways of dyeing it. You can put finishes into it so that you're getting these, you can change the colour of the material as you use it. So this has been heavily wax impregnated, but when you pull that over a relief, the colour will change. Calf hide, for instance. So now you're getting into another area altogether. So that's a standard, really, really beautiful calf hide. You've got all of this variety of material that you can choose from, all the way down to a salmon skin. And we've also used things like eel skins. I mean, I've got an eel skin here. Gives you an idea. That's an eel plate. This is lots of little eel skins put together, but it's absolutely beautiful. So when you're tanning for saddlery, or you're tanning for heavy shoe soles, or you're tanning for heavy leathers, you need to break down the size of the skins. You can't tan up to a heavy, heavy hide using one of these whole hides. It'd just simply be unmanageable, especially if these processes are still relatively hands-on in the vegetable tan industry. So for shoe soling and things, they'll cut the skins down into different sizes. That is the back of an animal. The tail is here. The backbone runs down the middle. This is in fact a slightly larger size than you would normally anticipate using. You would normally, if you were cutting a shoe sole, you would cut it half of this, which is called a bend, because that's 6 millimeters thick. It's the same material that we use for flooring. It's very, very heavy. When that's full of tan liquor in a tannery, it weighs enough for 2 people to be moving it around. So all these skins are cut down. But as a result of that, you end up with some quite interesting possibilities for myself and other designers that we work with, because all of these skins have a certain character, and the different parts of the body of the skin will have different characters. If we look at this skin here, you'll see what I mean. We use probably 5 or 6 specialist tanneries in Europe, and all of those tanneries are tanning specialist materials based around what people eat. All of this stuff I've shown you tonight is a byproduct of what we all eat. There's a good reason why in France, for instance, they tan the best calf skins. It's because they eat the most veal. You know, in England and Germany, Northern Europe, we're the best heavy leather tanners. And the reason is because we eat so much beef. So we've become specialists in it. Exactly the same reason why if you want beautiful lamb skins or goat skins, you go to southwest France or Spain. Everybody will specialise in basically what they eat, especially with the tanneries that we're dealing with. The view of leather that most people have is unfortunately the inside of a car or some hideous sofa. And those things are, you know, those are heavily pigmented, chrome tanned whole hides, which as far as I'm concerned have no character. They're never going to do anything. They're going to remain, you know, placid their whole life. They'll get no character, they'll never move. All of these materials and the types of material that we're trying to use will patinate, they will develop. So that's a shoulder of a cowhide tanned for the saddlery industry. The grain is completely natural. There's no attempt really being made, a little bit of correction but not much, has been made to hide the character of this skin. And if you were to look at a bundle of these, some would be marked, some would be scratched. There'd be sort of identification marks for the actual personality of the cow, let alone as to how you're going to use it, because that's going to change as well. But it's a really beautiful and interesting piece of leather. If you compare that shoulder with this one, which it's still a shoulder, but the colour's completely flat. And it's horrific, but it is what a lot of people would consider to be perfectly acceptable and interesting leather if it was in the right colour. It's not. It's awful. Here's a goat skin that's been corrected to the top surface. It's got lots of grain on it, but you can lift up the colour. It's still dyed through, so it's got its back on it. It's dyed through, but it's then corrected onto the top to give it colour. You can take a piece of suede and you can hand dye them, which we're doing a lot of. So you can literally hand colour these, so they are completely different as you go across each skin. And that's a suede that's been hand dyed. The next decision that you've got to think about is what sort of texture do you want? What surface do you want? Even just looking across the table there, you've got many, many different textures. You can go for natural textures, like this one, where you take a shoulder and shrink it, so the natural grain comes up and lifts right up, becomes quite powerful. This is a buffalo calf that, again, has got an entirely different character to it. Aniline dyed, so there's huge amounts of colour in it. There's lots of depth of colour and lots of change in the colour across the surface. There's lots of things that you can do now with printing techniques. Quite easy to take fabric printing or paper printing technology now and make zinc plates and print on them. You can laser etch on leather really easily. You can emboss on leather. You can take a brand, you can take a pattern and turn it into a printing plate and print right up to a whole hide now if you want to, even to the extent where you end up with truly hideous things like this. So the kind of mock grain that you would see, you know, is very popular. Some people love this. This one of our favourites, calf skin, the material itself, the fibre structure is incredibly fine. And because it's so fine, you can split it down very, very thin. And when it's this thin, you can start to get all sorts of different textures to it. And if you feel that in comparison to any of these other things that are going around, it's a completely different material. As a studio, mix up not only materials, but we also mix up techniques. So within the studio, in terms of the craftspeople that work there, we cover all sorts of different techniques. So we're covering bookbinding, saddlery, case making, shoe making, all of those skills we put under one roof. And when somebody comes to us with an idea that needs developing, we can take whatever idea they're going to and amplify it with those skills and develop the idea through the process of making it. And that's really important for me. That's why the designers are on the outside of the workshop, so that the designers are constantly interacting with the craftsmen the whole time. The craftsmen aren't in some back room, they're in the middle, the heart of the business. I mean, even if you take this door, there's bookbinding, saddlery, and I guess case making somehow in there as well. There's lots of different techniques which you can mash up. The shelves on the right, very much coming from saddlery and or shoemaking. It's wet moulding, which is the same process that you would use for lasting a shoe, but there's also hand stitched around the edge, which obviously is a saddlery technique. So it's about kind of taking all these ideas and materials. You can then think about what the final finish is going to be, what the handle is. And the handle is really important. Touch points are a perfect way of using leather, I think, and it's something that we're all familiar with. We know how things feel. It's got extraordinary resonance touch. You forget that touch, the actual feel of something, is quite an emotional response. One of the other advantages of leather we talk about a lot with architects and interior designers is it's the acoustic of leather is just fantastic. It gives you this lovely acoustic quality that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. The sound in here is really bright. If these walls were leather clad, you'd have this lovely, lovely warm sound. By the same token, it's amazingly thermal. You get I mean, afterwards, by all means, feel this concrete floor and feel the leather floor that's just directly on top of it. There's a good 5 to 10 degrees of difference between the two, and that's just using a piece of soling bend straight onto a concrete floor. It's thermally absolutely fantastic. It is naturally fire rated, so we don't all just self-combust, I suppose, but it automatically is type 1 fire rating. So as an interiors product, it's very, very useful. The final finish that you want to put onto your products is crucial. Not only are we talking about now the handle of them, as you've witnessed there, but also how bright do you want them to be. These are all buffalo calves, 3 buffalo calves, and they all look entirely different. You've got a very bright glazed finish. You can get a satin finish where you're just getting a kind of soft, warm sheen to it. and you can have a completely matte finish. All of this is controllable. Other ways of treating the material. We've been doing a lot of laser etching, we've been doing a lot of embroidery. Weaving leather, so that's knitted leather that we've just done. It's absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. This is a piece of embroidery. We've just done an entire room panelled in this as a panel. It's got a medium satin finish, but it's got this fantastic handle to it. And then weaving a cotton wool mix through it. So there's a lot of stuff now that you can do with leather in terms of mixing it with technology. I mean, going in the other direction, there's a piece of hand carving. You can touch on technology, you can mix it up with real, true, handcrafted things like that. Because this is really the kind of nuts and bolts of what we do with all the materials. This is taking all those materials and all those decisions that have been made and then applying techniques to them from all of these different crafts that are under one roof in the studio. This is a desktop in oak with a vegetable tan top to it. No radius on the wood, but the leather itself is a 1.5mm piece of bridal leather, and that's providing this perfect little 3mm radius. Skiving the edge of the leather so that the leather is actually slightly proud of the wood, probably by less than 1 millimetre, but just chamfering off the edge of the leather so that the light catches the leading edge of the leather about 8 to 10 millimetres in from the edge of the wood. It's really, really beautiful. The details that you can pull out of simply junctioning a piece of wood and a piece of leather are, I think, fantastic. Really simple old techniques like lacing, but then putting them into interiors, both for flooring or walls. This happens to be on this kind of 10mm lace, but that can be incredibly fine and incredibly delicate and beautiful, or it can look masculine and robust and bulky like this. Lots of weaving. Weaving soft panels like that as a carpet. This is for a Gothic house that we just designed the library for. And we took the original wall panelling where you've got a linen fold carved in oak, and we took the idea of the oak linen fold carved and put it into a leather. CNC routing a profile into wood panelling. Think about the spine of a book. It's got exactly the same technique. All we're doing is just stealing from bookbinding and putting it into architecture. So you're taking a single piece of leather and moulding it over this shape to give light. And as soon as that gets light on it or gets a shadow line on it, it starts to look really elegant. We've taken that same idea and done some really complex carvings now. This is a 1.8 by 1.4 door, pair of doors, 20 millimeters deep, so it's 2 centimeters deep carved by machine with one piece of leather stretched over the top of the whole thing and then burnished on the top surface. And it's that whole idea of mixing up these technologies now, which I think is quite exciting to us, especially if you start to see what's possible both in woodwork, carbon fibre, resins, all of these things are to play for. This is a shoe technique, but I kind of like this, it's rather subtle, but you're taking what looks like to be a plain stitch panel, but the stitch is actually inset into the thickness of the material. So from the side, the stitch line virtually disappears. Padding and stitching, we use a lot in cinemas. Cinemas, again, very, very, very good for leather walls because they have this fantastic acoustic. You can print the leather or shrink the leather to lift up the grain. You can also apply texture through stitching through a pad. That's taking that very thin lambskin that you saw earlier on and doing these completely invisible junctions. There's no stitch line in there at all, but it's kind of taking the very, very best out of wallet making and putting it into interiors. In a lambskin where you've got a touch, where the texture becomes important, cupboard doors, dressing room doors, all of these things become really, really key. And the closest thing to leather is felt. It's got no weft or weave. It's completely chaotic. The fibre structure is completely chaotic. So it will expand and compress by almost the same degree. So you can do these very, very nice compression junctions. You can dye the two skins and push them together. So you end up with these very, very sharp pin lines. And this one is not a junction at all. It's just a hot crease line, which is exactly how we did the gold line, which is again stealing directly from bookbinding. We're also doing lots of things like this, where you're not trying to cover an enormous wall. It gives you the opportunity to play with scale in terms of texture and finish, but you can really load it up with detail. You can Bombay them, you can take all of those ideas out of bag making or wallet making and put them into interiors. And even, for that matter, tennis rackets. We can wrap a lot of these. We do a lot of handrails in this tennis racket and a lot of baseball stitching on handrails. So we're kind of constantly crossing over different techniques. It's about combining up the techniques with materials and in collaboration. I mean, that's the other thing that we do a lot of. Only about 40% of what we do, we design entirely ourselves. 60% of what we do in collaboration with a designer. And that is really exciting, both in terms of the kind of constraints that brings, but also in terms of what energy and ideas that brings. So you're constantly being posed with different questions, different opportunities, different kind of, creative ideas that make collaborations really, really interesting. And the best designers that we work with are people that come to us early in the procedure and start saying, we want to use leather in this job, and this is the sort of idea that we want to use, and how do we progress it? And when people come up to the studio and you start seeing this times 10, you really start to see the opportunity, and you really start to be able to build up, the fabric and the roots of an idea get really properly dug in.